May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the thunder of artillery. In a field outside Frankfurt, rows of German women stood under a gray morning sky. Nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, and wives of soldiers. Their uniforms hung loose on their thin frames, insignias hastily torn away. Behind them, the banners of the Reich had been reduced to rags, trampled into the mud. An American officer barked an order. The women hesitated, confused, clutching what little they had left: blankets, ration tins, or the last strands of dignity. Then came the shears. Military barbers moved down the line with rough precision, their scissors flashing in the cold light. One by one, the women's long hair fell to the ground, a silent rain of blonde and brown tangled with dirt and tears. For many, it was worse than surrender. In a nation that had worshipped beauty and order, the cutting of a woman's hair was more than punishment. It was erasure. Each lock that fell symbolized the collapse of a myth, the myth of purity, of pride, of superiority. What remained was only humanity, stripped bare beneath the weight of defeat. Germany, May 1945. A country unrecognizable even to its own people. The grand illusions of the Third Reich had burned away, leaving behind a landscape of ruins and disbelief. Cities that once stood as symbols of power, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, were now fields of shattered stone and twisted steel. Amid the rubble moved the defeated, soldiers, refugees, widows, and prisoners, each carrying the invisible scars of a war that had consumed everything. In this desolate aftermath, millions of Germans found themselves under Allied occupation, but none experienced the humiliation of defeat more viscerally than the women, particularly those who had served the Nazi regime. Many had been nurses in the Wehrmacht or the SS, communication aides, factory laborers, or members of the League of German Girls. Others were wives and sisters of soldiers, swept into the machinery of a nation built on obedience. When the Reich fell, so did their identity. By June 1945, the Allied forces, American, British, French, and Soviet, began the enormous task of disarming, processing, and repatriating millions of prisoners of war. Among them were an estimated 500,000 German women in uniform or auxiliary service. Most were not combatants, but their association with the Nazi war effort made them symbols of a regime the world wanted to erase. And in the chaos of liberation, symbolism often became punishment. For the Allies, hygiene was a practical concern. Typhus, lice, and disease were spreading rapidly through refugee camps and detention centers. Delousing became mandatory. In many cases, it was carried out efficiently and without malice. But in others, especially in regions that had suffered under Nazi occupation, the process took on a darker meaning. In France, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, the world saw images of collaboration punished through public humiliation. Crowds gathered as women accused of sleeping with German soldiers were dragged into town squares, their heads forcibly shaved before jeering mobs. Some were stripped, others beaten or paraded through the streets, their shame broadcast as retribution for years of occupation. To the victors, it was catharsis. To the women, it was annihilation, a complete destruction of identity. In Germany itself, the same ritual echoed within prisoner camps. At first, it was justified as sanitation. The delousing powder, DDT, was meant to prevent epidemics. The cutting of hair was a precaution, nothing more. But for the women standing in those lines, surrounded by armed guards, the scissors meant something else entirely. They had been taught since childhood that a woman's hair was her honor, a symbol of purity, femininity, and national pride. In Nazi propaganda, long braided hair was idealized as the hallmark of Aryan beauty. It appeared on recruitment posters, in films, and in magazines. To cut it was to destroy the image of the perfect German woman, to mark her as defeated, unworthy, tainted. Even among the Allies, there were mixed emotions about the practice. Some American officers disapproved, calling it unnecessary cruelty. Others saw it as a necessary act of symbolic justice, stripping away the pride of a nation that had brought so much pain. The Soviet forces, hardened by years of atrocities on the Eastern Front, showed little restraint. In many camps under Red Army control, women accused of being SS auxiliaries were shorn, beaten, or worse. Their hair was not only cut but sometimes burned, as if to cleanse the memory of what it represented. For the German women, the humiliation went far beyond the physical act. Hair, once a source of confidence and attraction, became a mark of disgrace. They covered their heads with scarves, hats, or bandages, avoiding mirrors and conversation. Some wrote in diaries that they felt less than human. Others admitted that the haircut, not the defeat, not the loss of home, was the moment when they truly understood the collapse of their world. A former Luftwaffe radio operator named Inge remembered it vividly. "We were told to line up. I thought they would search us. But then they brought scissors. They didn't even look at us, they just cut. When it was over, I felt cold as if I had been peeled open. That was when I realized Germany had ended." In camps run by the Americans and British, the procedure was often methodical, documented in reports and photographs. The women were deloused, issued plain clothes, and their uniforms burned. For health officers, it was routine, another box to check. For the prisoners, it was a stripping away of everything that connected them to who they had been. When the hair fell, so too did the last fragments of pride. But humiliation was not limited to prisoners of war. Across post-war Europe, the shearing of women became a cultural phenomenon, a public spectacle that symbolized vengeance against collaboration and betrayal. The French called it la tente des femmes, the shaving of women. Between 20,000 and 25,000 women were targeted across France in the months following liberation. Their crime, intimacy, real or alleged, with German men. The punishment, to be paraded bald through the same streets where years earlier German soldiers had marched. Though these events took place outside Germany, the message was universal. In the ruins of war, a woman's body and appearance became battlegrounds of honor and retribution. For the German female POWs, even within guarded camps, the shame echoed the same ritualistic stripping of identity. They had been part of the Reich's machinery, whether willingly or by circumstance, and now they paid the price. Inside many German detention centers, the women endured another layer of indignity, the burning of their uniforms. To the Allies, it was a sanitary measure, the woolen cloth often infested with lice. But for the women, it felt like the destruction of their last connection to a world that had vanished overnight. The gray-green fabric, the insignia of the eagle, the Iron Cross, all of it turned to ash. And yet, beneath the humiliation and despair, a strange kind of clarity began to take hold. For the first time, stripped of uniforms, stripped of hair, the women faced themselves not as symbols of a nation but as individuals. No longer soldiers or servants of the Führer, they were simply human, broken, frightened, and free of illusion. Reports from Allied medical units note that many German women, once deloused and processed, displayed emotional detachment, a blankness that worried their captors. But psychologists who interviewed them later suggested something else, that the haircutting, while traumatic, had also been a brutal kind of cleansing. It forced them to confront the truth they had been shielded from, that their pride had been built on lies, and their obedience had led them into ruin. In time, this awareness would evolve into something deeper, a reckoning not just for individuals, but for a nation. The process of denazification, initiated by the Allies in 1946, demanded more than disarming the German military. It required dismantling the entire psychological structure of the Reich, the mythology of superiority, obedience, and purity. And for many German women, that process began in the moment the scissors touched their hair. For the Allies, it was hygiene. For the women, it was rebirth, painful, humiliating, but ultimately transformative. The shears cut more than hair. They severed the illusion of invincibility. And that moment, quiet, shamed, unspoken, became the mirror of Germany's surrender. They said it was for hygiene, but everyone knew it was more than that. The cutting of women's hair after Germany's defeat became one of the most symbolic acts of the war's aftermath, a gesture that carried the weight of both vengeance and purification. Every Allied camp had its own methods, but the ritual was universal: line up, delouse, and shear. In those moments, power changed hands. To the Allied guards, the act often felt practical, necessary. They were under orders to prevent outbreaks of lice and typhus, diseases that had killed thousands in previous wars. The delousing powder, DDT, was new, a chemical weapon turned to humanitarian use. Every new prisoner, male or female, was stripped of uniform and personal effects, dusted head to toe and processed for quarantine. But even for those who performed the procedure, there was no denying the unease that came with cutting a woman's hair. Many soldiers turned their eyes away. Some refused the duty entirely. Others, hardened by years of hatred, carried it out with a cold sense of retribution. In American-run camps, the process was organized but impersonal. Military barbers or female auxiliaries carried out the task swiftly, often in silence. The women were told to sit, their hair gathered in bundles, cut short to the scalp and thrown aside. In British sectors, female nurses sometimes volunteered to help, believing their presence would spare the women deeper humiliation. It rarely did. A German woman named Erika later wrote, "The scissors did not hurt, but the laughter did." The Soviet camps were different. For the Red Army, whose homeland had been ravaged by German occupation, the act carried fury. Female SS auxiliaries captured on the Eastern Front were treated harshly. Shaved heads were not only punishment but identification, a mark of guilt and submission. For those women, captivity under the Soviets was a descent into retribution. Many never returned. Those who did carried the memory of the clippers buzzing near their ears, the sound of power reversing. Across occupied Europe, hair became a form of language. For the conquerors, it said, "You are no longer pure." For the conquered, it whispered, "You are no longer who you were." But this gesture, though brutal, did not emerge from nowhere. In wartime Europe, hair had long been symbolic. Under the Nazi regime, women's hair was political. Posters depicted German girls with braided blonde hair and serene faces, the archetype of Aryan virtue. The braid was not just fashion, it was propaganda. It signified discipline, fertility, and loyalty to the nation. A woman's beauty was to serve the Reich, just as her body served motherhood and obedience. The Reich's obsession with order extended to appearance. The ideal woman was modest yet strong, maternal yet pure. In contrast, the regime mocked the short-haired women of the 1920s, the new women of Weimar Germany, who had dared to smoke, work, and vote. Hitler himself despised the bob haircut, calling it unnatural. In the 1930s, the state rewrote femininity into a uniform of its own. Long hair, plain dresses, a clean, traditional look meant to reflect racial purity. When the Allies cut that hair, they were not just cleansing for health. They were dismantling a symbol. Each snip of the scissors tore through years of propaganda, reducing ideology to dust. The physical act became metaphorical, the erasure of a myth built on vanity and control. Psychologists who later studied post-war testimonies called it symbolic disarmament. The women, stripped of their hair, experienced the same loss of identity that the German nation felt as it faced occupation and guilt. Some wept openly. Others stood rigid, too numb to feel. "We had lived in illusion," one wrote years later. "When they cut my hair, I saw how much I had believed in lies." For the women of the SS Helferinnen Corps, the female auxiliaries of the German war machine, the humiliation was especially profound. Many had worked in communications, logistics, and camp administration. Some were as young as 18, swept up in nationalist fervor. They had worn their uniforms with pride, believing themselves part of something eternal. When captured, that illusion vanished in an instant. Their uniforms were burned, their insignias confiscated, and their hair cut short until they barely recognized themselves. Photographs from American camps show young women staring blankly at the ground, their scalps patchy, their eyes hollow. The Allied officers who documented these scenes rarely reflected on the emotional toll. But the images endure, haunting, raw, silent. Rows of women in plain coats, their shaved heads shining under the pale sun. No one needed to explain what had happened. The picture said everything, pride reduced to dust. Not all soldiers were comfortable with what they witnessed. Private Raymond Collins, stationed at a processing camp near Stuttgart, later wrote in his journal, "I didn't like seeing them cry. We were told it was procedure, but it felt like something else, like we were cutting the war out of them, one lock at a time." For some of the German women, the haircut became a form of penance, not chosen but accepted. They saw in it the physical manifestation of guilt, a punishment that matched their nation's collapse. One former propaganda clerk wrote, "I had believed in purity and now I looked like impurity itself." Perhaps that was justice. Yet among the humiliation, small acts of dignity emerged. In certain camps, the women comforted one another. cutting their own hair in solidarity before the guards could. Others kept strands of their hair hidden in pockets, as if preserving a memory of who they once were. A few years later would frame those strands in glass boxes, reminders of the moment their old lives had ended. This paradox, humiliation and renewal intertwined, defined the experience of many German women after the war. Stripped of symbols, they began to see themselves not through ideology, but through survival. The same women who once recited slogans of superiority now shared bread with French and Polish captives. The same hands that had typed orders for the Reich now washed floors in Allied hospitals. In losing everything, they gained perspective. Historians often speak of Germany's moral collapse in abstract terms: Nazism's fall, denazification, the trials at Nuremberg. But the real reckoning happened quietly, in camps and clinics, in barbers' chairs and mirrorless barracks. The haircutting was one moment in a larger dismantling of belief, the kind that doesn't make headlines but defines generations. The symbolism deepened as post-war Europe watched. In the newspapers of 1945, photographs of shorn women became visual shorthand for justice. In Paris, in Prague, in Berlin, the sight of bare heads in the street signaled the end of tyranny. But behind every image was a human being, often young, often misled, always humiliated. The world needed symbols of punishment, but the individuals bore the weight. In the long view of history, the scissors cut through both hair and myth. The women who experienced it carried that memory all their lives. Some withdrew from public life, ashamed to be seen. Others channeled the experience into reflection, writing memoirs that spoke of transformation through loss. One such memoir, written by a former Red Cross nurse named Herta, ended with a line that still resonates. "They took our hair, but they gave us truth. I no longer believed in the world I had served. I began to believe in myself." By the late 1940s, Germany was rebuilding. The rubble was being cleared, and so too were the remnants of ideology. Many of the women who had been shorn re-entered society quietly, some as teachers, some as mothers, others as civil servants in the new democratic state. Their hair grew back, but their humility remained. The memory of the scissors stayed with them, not as a scar of shame, but as a reminder of rebirth. And yet, the act remained controversial. Was it justice or cruelty disguised as hygiene? Historians still debate it. Some argue it was a necessary step in denazification, a visual cleansing of a guilty generation. Others call it collective punishment, an emotional revenge taken on the most vulnerable. The truth lies somewhere between. The haircutting was not ordered by high command. It emerged from the chaos of victory and defeat. It was the world's instinctive attempt to cleanse itself of hatred, to mark the fall of a poisoned dream. But like every act born of trauma, it left its own scars. And in those scars, history speaks softly, not of vengeance but of consequence. Because when the scissors stopped, and silence returned, something else began. The long, painful rebirth of a nation learning to see itself without illusion. It happened quietly, without speeches or ceremony. Only the hum of clippers, the snip of steel, the occasional sob that broke through the cold morning air. Inside a requisitioned gymnasium outside Weimar, rows of German women sat on wooden stools, each waiting her turn. They had been marched there by Allied MPs, processed, deloused, and told that every prisoner, regardless of rank or gender, would undergo the same sanitary procedure. But everyone in that room knew it was something more. The war was over. The Reich had fallen, but this was the moment they felt it. For years, their lives had been defined by structure, obedience, perfection. A single braid or polished boot was part of an identity built on the illusion of order and superiority. They had carried bandages, messages, and rifles in service to an empire that promised eternity. And now, with every lock of hair that fell, that eternity dissolved into dust. One woman sat frozen as the barber worked. Her name was Anneliese, a nurse from the Eastern Front. Only 24 years old, she had survived the retreat from Königsberg, the starvation marches, and the chaos of surrender. Yet nothing had prepared her for this. The moment the scissors touched her scalp, her hands clenched in her lap, her breath caught. She did not cry. She only stared at the floor as her hair gathered in a growing pile around her shoes. When the barber stepped away, she looked into a small shard of broken mirror lying nearby. For the first time since the war began, she did not recognize the person staring back. Around her, others wept silently. The room was filled not with noise, but with the strange rhythm of transformation. The mechanical snipping, the faint sound of boots on the wooden floor, the shallow breaths of shame. A British female medic assigned to supervise tried to comfort them. "It's for health," she said softly, but she could hear the hollowness in her own words. She knew these women understood that this was not only about lice or disease. It was about cleansing history itself. Outside, piles of discarded hair drifted in the wind like straw. Passers-by stopped to watch, not out of cruelty but disbelief. Just weeks earlier, these same women had walked the streets of occupied cities in spotless uniforms, their postures straight, their hair braided neatly under military caps. They had represented the face of German pride, disciplined, pure, unyielding. Now they were ghosts of that image, their heads bare, their eyes cast down. A U.S. Army photographer assigned to document the camp took a single picture that day. The photo would never make headlines, but it captured what entire volumes of history could not. A young German woman, her head newly shorn, standing before a mirror, hand trembling as she touched the uneven stubble on her scalp. Her uniform jacket had been replaced by coarse prisoner fabric. Behind her, sunlight poured through a broken window, cutting a white line across her face. In that light, humiliation and revelation blurred into one. That photograph, preserved in archives today, became emblematic of what historians later called the moral haircut of Europe. The war had not only stripped Germany of its empire, it had stripped its people of illusion. The climax of this transformation came not in violence, but in silence. In one camp near Stuttgart, the delousing station processed more than 300 women in a single day. The smell of disinfectant filled the air. White powder clung to their necks like frost. An American corporal, barely 20, was assigned to sweep the floor afterward. He remembered years later, "I kept seeing hair everywhere. Blonde, brown, black, piles of it. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt like touching something sacred that had died." The women emerged from the building changed. Some covered their heads immediately. Others walked bareheaded into the sun, stunned into stillness. For many, the physical humiliation triggered something deeper, a collapse of faith. Everything they had believed about purity, strength, and destiny had been cut away with their hair. They were no longer soldiers nor servants of an idea. They were simply women, frightened, mortal, and free from illusion. Not all accepted this willingly. Some shouted that they had done nothing wrong, that they had served their nation with honor. Others cursed their captors, spitting on the ground as they were led away. But even their defiance was hollow. The Reich that had once validated their obedience no longer existed. There was no audience left for their pride. Among the Allied personnel, reactions varied. The Americans were pragmatic, the British uneasy, the Soviets often merciless. But even the most hardened soldiers could sense that something irreversible was happening. In cutting the women's hair, they were not only stripping away identity, they were witnessing the symbolic end of an era. An intelligence officer from London, who had interviewed several German auxiliaries, wrote in his report, "These women have lost their faith more completely than their freedom. The act of shaving their heads has accomplished what 1,000 lectures on democracy could not. It has made them see themselves without myth," and it was true. For decades, the women of Nazi Germany had been told that their worth was tied to service and sacrifice, that their beauty reflected the purity of the race, that their obedience was their strength. They had sung songs of loyalty, raised their children for the Führer, and filled factories with precision. Yet in that single act, the cutting of hair, the ideology collapsed under its own vanity. Inge, a former Luftwaffe clerk, described the moment with brutal clarity. "It was not the loss of hair that broke me. It was the realization that I had never been free to begin with. I had worn my hair long because they told me it was beautiful. I had believed them. When they cut it, I finally saw how deep their control went. The transformation spread beyond the camps. Across occupied Germany, the sight of shaven-headed women became a quiet symbol of the nation's defeat. To some, it was justice. To others, tragedy. But to the women themselves, it became a strange kind of awakening. Weeks later, when mirrors were finally returned to the barracks, many of the women stared at their reflections for long minutes. Some flinched. Others smiled faintly, almost in disbelief. "We looked like children," one recalled. "It was as if the war had taken everything away and left us with nothing but our faces." For the first time, they saw not propaganda or pride but survival. The face of a woman who had endured hunger, fear, and guilt and was still alive. The Americans noticed the shift. Reports from the Office of Military Government noted that morale among female detainees improved after several weeks. Once initial humiliation subsides, one officer wrote, they begin to display greater cooperation and even curiosity about our way of life. It was as if, freed from the weight of false identity, they could finally begin again. In the coming months, many of those women would be released back into civilian life. They would walk through cities they barely recognized, their cropped hair marking them as prisoners, collaborators, or simply survivors. At first, they were met with whispers and stares. But slowly, as reconstruction began, their shame turned into something quieter: resilience. They found work in hospitals, schools, and offices. They learned to rebuild with their hands what they had once helped destroy. And in that rebuilding, they discovered the strength they had been denied by ideology. The hair that had fallen in humiliation would grow again, but the lesson remained. For some, the haircut had been an ending. For others, it was a beginning. The moment the scissors touched their hair, they lost everything they had known. But when they looked into the mirror afterward, stripped of illusion, they saw something the Reich had never shown them: the truth of who they were. And in that truth lay the seed of a nation's rebirth, quiet, raw, and painfully human. The aftermath of Germany's surrender was not measured only in ruins or borders, but in the quiet transformations of those who had once served its fallen cause. For the women whose hair had been cut in the name of cleansing or retribution, the humiliation was not fleeting. It became a lifelong mark of defeat, of reawakening and of reckoning. Across the occupied zones, the newly bald or shorn heads of German women became an unmistakable sight. Some were former auxiliaries, nurses, or clerks who had worked within the Nazi system. Others were merely suspected collaborators, punished in the streets by their own neighbors. In cities like Hamburg, Nuremberg, and Berlin, mobs occasionally gathered to drag women accused of fraternizing with the enemy into the open. Their hair was shorn amidst jeers, their faces painted with tar, and their shame displayed like an example. The Allies had not ordered these particular acts, but they did not intervene. The public demanded a release, and the act of cutting, symbolic and intimate, provided it. Yet within the internment camps, the same gesture held a different meaning. There it was procedural, standardized, bureaucratic, methodical. Allied medical staff justified the delousing and shaving as preventive hygiene, citing the outbreaks of typhus that had ravaged prisoner populations in recent months. The clippers were cold, the reasoning practical, but the effect devastating. To the women, it was not hygiene. It was identity reduced to compliance. The hair that had once signified control, youth, and belonging was gone, and with it, the last illusion of self within the crumbling hierarchy of a dead regime. In the months that followed, Allied documentation began to reflect an unexpected shift. Reports from the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division described a surprising calm among female detainees after several weeks of captivity. Many show signs of reflection, one report from August 1945 noted. They speak less of Hitler and more of family, hunger, and guilt. This psychological transformation did not stem from punishment alone. It came from the slow confrontation with silence. For the first time in years, the propaganda loudspeakers had gone quiet. There were no speeches, no orders, no music of victory. Only silence, broken by the hum of reconstruction. Outside the camps, the women faced a nation trying to find its reflection in the mirror. Germany's cities were gutted, its institutions dismantled, its pride dismantled as thoroughly as its buildings. Amidst this devastation, women, many of them former auxiliaries or war widows, became the backbone of survival. With millions of men dead or missing, it was the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who picked up the pieces, both literal and moral. They wore scarves over their cropped hair as they lifted bricks, cleared debris, and dug out what remained of their homes. Their appearance, once a mark of humiliation, it became a symbol of endurance. Photographs from 1946 and 1947 show them in the ruins of Dresden, Munich, and Cologne. Their hands rough, their faces blank, but their movements steady. They no longer needed permission to act. They simply rebuilt because there was nothing else to do. The Allied officers observing the recovery noticed it too. A U.S. Army correspondent in Frankfurt wrote, These women who once walked with heads bowed in shame are now the ones holding up the sky. For the female POWs who had been released, returning home was another form of captivity. Many were unwelcome in their towns, marked as former collaborators or symbols of a disgraced order. Some found their families scattered, their homes destroyed, their identities erased from official records. But with time, the boundaries between guilt and survival began to blur. What had started as punishment became a quiet passage into humility. By 1947, when Germany's social order began its slow reorganization, hair length itself had become a silent political statement. The young women who came of age under Allied occupation began cutting their hair short by choice, practical, modern, unburdened by the long traditional styles of the Nazi past. What had once been imposed through humiliation evolved into a symbol of liberation. Cultural historians later noted the irony. The haircut that once marked defeat became, within a few years, the haircut of freedom. In the former POW camps, medical staff wrote about the psychological recovery of the female detainees. Many displayed signs of post-traumatic guilt, yet they also demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Their cooperation in rebuilding hospitals, schools, and refugee centers was crucial. American and British welfare officers began training these women for civilian service. Former Wehrmacht nurses became midwives and caregivers in Allied hospitals. Secretaries who once filed military orders now helped translate relief documents. Slowly, their work began to overwrite their past. But not all stories ended with redemption. There were those who never spoke again of their humiliation. Some refused to be photographed or left their towns entirely, changing their names, seeking anonymity in the rubble of post-war Germany. The shame of that single act, the haircut, lingered far longer than many wounds of war. To be stripped of identity in front of strangers was to lose the self. For some, that loss was permanent. Still, others chose to remember. Decades later, in interviews collected by German historians, many of these women spoke with quiet clarity about those days. One recalled, "When they cut our hair, I thought I would die of shame. But now I know it was the moment my life began again. They took everything that tied me to lies." Her words echoed the transformation of an entire generation. Out of humiliation came reflection. Out of reflection, rebirth. The Allied occupation authorities, while enforcing justice, could not have foreseen how deeply symbolic their procedures would become. The delousing stations, the uniform confiscations, the haircuts, all became part of a collective unmasking. The German people were being shown themselves without the illusion of power, stripped down to humanity. In 1948, when West Germany began its reconstruction under the Marshall Plan, many of those same women stood in food lines, their hair grown back but their expressions tempered. They were no longer the idealized Aryan women of propaganda posters. They were human beings who had faced truth and survived it. Among the rubble, photographs captured their faces, women shoveling bricks, nursing infants, pushing wheelbarrows through snow. There was no glamour left, no ideology, only resilience. The same women once humbled in prison camps were now rebuilding schools and shelters. Their cropped hair, once the mark of disgrace, had grown into a quiet symbol of rebirth. By the early 1950s, few spoke openly of the forced haircuts. It was an uncomfortable memory, one that did not fit neatly into the narrative of national recovery. Yet historians would later argue that it was one of the most significant acts of post-war transformation. The symbolic dismantling of a culture obsessed with appearances, obedience, and purity. When the Federal Republic of Germany emerged from its ruins, so too did a new vision of womanhood. No longer the passive bearer of ideology, the German woman had become the worker, the builder, the mother of reconstruction. Behind this quiet transformation lay the echoes of 1945, the sound of scissors, the whisper of hair falling to the floor, the silence that followed. For those who had lived through it, the memory never faded. In private, many kept the same habit for decades, wearing their hair short, practical, humble. It was not fashion, it was remembrance, a reminder that pride can vanish in a moment, but dignity, once reclaimed, endures. The scissors that once symbolized humiliation had, in an unexpected way, cut through something larger than vanity. They had severed the connection between a people and their delusions, and as the new Germany emerged, built by the very hands once trembling in shame, The world began to see that transformation not as defeat, but as proof of endurance. Because from the floor of that makeshift barbershop, where hair lay tangled in the dust of a broken empire, grew the first fragile roots of redemption. Time softens memory, but not truth. Decades after the war ended, the women who once sat in those makeshift barbershops still remembered the cold touch of scissors against their skin. They remembered the silence, the kind that follows a world collapsing, the kind that forces reflection when all illusions are gone. Their humiliation was not written into military reports or commemorated in memorials. It lived quietly, passed through stories, diaries, and the rare photograph that caught their eyes just before the first cut. Yet in that silence, something profound took root, a reckoning that reshaped not only the women themselves but an entire generation. The cutting of hair had been meant to strip dignity, but in time it revealed a deeper strength. It exposed the fragility of false pride and the resilience of those forced to confront it. What began as an act of control became a mirror, reflecting how fragile human power is when confronted with truth. The Reich had fallen not only in battle but in belief, and the women who once embodied its image became the first to live its consequences. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt not only its cities but its conscience. Those who had once been humbled became the caretakers of memory. Their lives, simple and unspoken, carried lessons that no treaty or trial could convey. That dignity is not given by nations or uniforms, but reclaimed in silence, in endurance, and in honesty. The hair they lost grew back, but they never forgot the feeling of being laid bare before the world. In that exposure, they rediscovered humanity, stripped of ideology, stripped of illusion, and finally free. And perhaps that was the quietest victory of all. Not the triumph of armies, but the redemption of the human spirit found not in glory but in humility.